welcome to Lawgical, the UAE's first and only regular legal podcast. My name's Tim Elliott. I'm here with Ludmila Yamalova, managing partner of the Dubai-based legal firm HPL Yamalova and Plethka. We're in JLT, Jumeirah Lakes Towers, on the 18th floor of Reef Tower here in Dubai. Ludmila, it's always good to see you.
It's always good to be here with you, Tim.
Now, an acronym today, OFAC, OFAC. I'm going to come clean. I had to look this up. I have to look a lot of things up before I talk to you, so no surprises. I'd never heard of OFAC until earlier this week. So here goes. It's the Office of Foreign Assets Control. It's a financial intelligence and enforcement agency of the U.S. Treasury Department. It administers and enforces economic and trade sanctions in support of U.S. national security and foreign policy objectives. Now, that's from the website, okay? I have, of course, heard of sanctions, and really that's what we're going to be talking about. That is what OFAC is all about.
Indeed, and OFAC it is, and I have to also make a confession. Until about maybe a year ago, I also did not know what OFAC stood for. I had heard, and obviously I had known some general guidelines of what it was all about, but I wasn't intimately familiar with what it was and how it actually worked, especially in particular in the context of perhaps my clients and my own practice.
But isn't that the way with the legal field? You just need to throw in you need to pepper your chat with the odd acronym, and people are like, people nod sagely and they think, oh, she really knows what she's talking about.
Yeah, perhaps that was me for many years until about a year ago, whenever this topic came about. And I remember I did know a lot of friends who are lawyers at various firms and that specialize in this particular subject or were working on a specific project. And even I remember some very close lawyer friends of mine who would travel from the U.S. to the UAE to specifically on like an OFAC related discovery project. And sort of in general terms, you hear it with one ear, but you don't really get involved too much until it actually really comes close home or concerns you. And so it was. So yes, you just brought to light my previous attempt to just nod my head. Yes. I knew exactly what it stood for. I knew something about sanctions, but what it related to, how was it enforced, what was regulated by. It wasn't really of interest to me very much before.
Okay. Well, in full disclosure, I've been nodding sagely at you for the last nearly 4 years on this podcast, and so far it's worked. Look, why are we talking about OFAC now? Why this particular point?
Well, for a number of reasons, and why perhaps I had to learn quickly about OFAC was because it concerned our own practice here in the UAE, and that's because of the recent sanctions that were introduced by the U.S. and other Western authorities in the context of Russian war in Ukraine, and there were a lot of perhaps Russian businesses that were. Businesses and individuals that were migrating, transitioning, sort of moving to the UAE and the region in the context of the war, and as a result, all of a sudden, these sort of sanctions and kind of the effect of the sanctions very quickly bled into this region as well. In particular, my practice, because obviously I speak Russian, I have a lot of Russian-speaking clients over the years, and so when the sanctions kicked in or started being introduced, you obviously become very familiar with, and because you're approached by a number of Russian-speaking clients who are, for a number of legitimate reasons as well, trying to move base in terms of their businesses and their lives into the UAE. So, I mean, that's my own story in terms of what brought me closer to learning the subject in particular. But this is not a new subject to the UAE, by the way. So, OFAC, I mean, again, this is the Office of Foreign Assets Control. There's different lists that are created over the years and with regards to different countries and individuals and interests. that are considered to be a security threat to the U.S. interests and other sort of partner countries, but in particular the U.S. interest because it's a U.S. organization. And they historically have included sort of the specific lists that relate to specific sanctions for specific countries, right? And so in the UAE, for example, there's been lists related to Iran, the various Iran-related sanctions, or Sudan-related sanctions, or Syria-related sanctions, or Yemen-related sanctions. So the OFAC is not a new subject and not a new concept in the UAE with regards to just in general. And there have been a lot of businesses and interests and individuals in this region that have been perhaps much more familiar with the impact of OFAC sanctions a lot earlier. And so if you go on the OFAC sort of sanctions list, I mean, you'll see the different designations by different countries and interests and people that are considered at any given point in time a threat to the U.S. sort of national interest, and so they appear on these different search criteria. So yeah, they go way, way, way back. So these are just the newer line of sanctions in the wake of the Russian war in Ukraine, and so and hence it kind of hit home much closer to me personally. Where I had to learn very quickly about what it meant, and also understand what I can and cannot do in the context of OFAC application. And I choose these words carefully because, and we can go through the nitty-gritty kind of nuances of what these sanctions are and their overall impact. But let's not forget, these are U.S. regulations. These are U.S. sanctions.
Yes.
And we're not in the U.S. We're in the UAE, geographically very far away from the UAE. So the question would be, so why does it matter? Like, why does it matter in general? And certainly, how does it affect me personally? Me here practicing law in the UAE and not in the US. It's interesting because the spectrum of the sanctions is quite broad. It basically relates to anything to do with either within the U.S. or with U.S. persons. So, and I am a U.S. citizen, and therefore, and I'm also a U.S. qualified lawyer. So on many different levels, I am therefore subject to these sanctions, to these regulations as well, and therefore these regulations impact me in terms of my ability to work or do business with anyone who potentially may be on OFAC lists.
Right.
Yeah, and so, but just kind of take a step back in terms of just setting the frame of the legal frame of what OFAC is. It's so, as you said, rightfully said, it's the U.S. Treasury Department, but it's basically the Office of Foreign Assets Control, and it's the purpose of this is they're responsible for issuing and enforcing sanctions list, and also general licenses, specific licenses that will allow you perhaps to provide certain kind of to modify the sanctions or to limit the impact of the sanctions, and these sanctions are issued usually on the back of a presidential executive order. So the executive orders that come out with a sort of list of countries and individuals, and then on the back of that, other regulations follow in terms of the implications. And so at the high level, the OFAC is responsible for enforcing sanctions on certain countries, organizations, and people. For example, OFAC can designate certain people and entities whose assets by virtue of the sanctions will be blocked. And that's basically, and those are called the sanctions, or the blocked persons, or the blocked individuals. And those blockage, the effect of this sort of being blocked affects the sanctions persons transacting within the United States with any U.S. persons, entities, goods, or services. And so one of the primary consequences of these blockages is the inability to conduct transactions using U.S. dollars, which is a U.S. good. And this entails the inability, for example, to withdraw or transfer or deposit any kind of money through not just U.S. dollars, but through any entities that deal with U.S. dollars. So that perhaps is the is the most interesting aspect of these sanctions. On the one hand, these are purely U.S. regulations, and as we know, in terms of sort of sovereignty, every country's sovereignty and the limitations jurisdiction, the U.S. regulations can only apply within the U.S. And obviously, they can apply to the U.S. Depending on the sanctions and the consequences or circumstances. They can all apply to U.S. people, but in this particular case, why their impact is so important and so effective is because they affect any entity that deals with U.S. dollars, in addition to obviously U.S. people. And what is that? That's basically every bank. So any bank
that severely limits your ability to indulge really in any international business.
Absolutely. So in other words, let's give you an example. So for example, if there's an entity that is on OFAC list or individual that's on OFAC list, and these entities and individuals may not have maybe hundreds of thousands of miles away from the U.S. itself, and not really doing even any business with any U.S. entity in any particular jurisdiction, but just by virtue of being on the sanction list, if they want to do any transactions, any banking transactions, they will be blocked from doing so, and that's because they're considered blocked. And so the way the sanctions are drafted in different ways, but for example, you could have specific companies that are blocked, right? Specific companies. They can also have specific individuals that are blocked. And in most cases, when an individual is blocked, the sanctions extend to all other, for example, interests or entities that are controlled by that particular individual, even if they're not specifically or expressly listed in the sanctions list. So, for example, an individual can be considered or can be blocked individual, and that individual, for example, has 5 entities as well that specifically are listed in the list. But in addition to that, the sanctions will state that this is the individual, these are the entities, and any other interests that this person or this blocked individual may control or have, irrespective of whether they're specifically stated or not. Which means that if that let's say there is another company or another bank account where that individual's name is listed, they will be considered by default and implicitly a blocked entity. So now let's say if that particular individual is merely a director at a company, and therefore is listed with the bank as a signatory. So the company doesn't belong to that individual, for example, and she, for example, is not she or he is not even necessarily a director of the company, but is just a signatory to a bank account. That in of itself will make that bank customer a blocked entity. And why that is because all banks that deal with U.S. dollar, and that's a U.S. good under these regulations, therefore are subject to ultimately these sanctions. So that's the simplest way of saying it. So if you are, it doesn't matter that you are not in the U.S. and that you are not even a U.S. company and you're not dealing with any U.S. entities, as long as you are on this list, without any transactions you start making as an entity, then will become automatically blocked now. And so that's actually quite an interesting sort of, it's in the U.S. you call it kind of the long arm, the reach of the U.S. jurisdiction.
Yeah.
And so that's an interesting example, a very effective one, because let's face it, a lot of in general in the world, everything sort of to a large extent is governed by money, right? And so that means whatever services, whatever goods that are happening, and the people only do things ultimately, not only, but ultimately for money. And so, but how do you transfer money? So, and so we've had to kind of come up to speed very quickly with regards to the OFAC because all of a sudden these, I'm a U.S. individual, I'm a U.S. citizen, and I'm also a U.S. lawyer, and I'm based here, and I run my practice as basic on the basis of my U.S. qualifications and such. And so therefore, but I'm also a Russian speaker, although I'm Ukrainian. So I had a number of Russian-speaking clients, potential clients coming my way. So in the wake of the war, which made me a lot more aware of the sanctions, because obviously they were trying to set up base to try to deal with the sanctions. Some evade, some circumvent, some just basically address. You just legitimate businesses, legitimate people trying to address the impact of the sanctions by moving to the UAE. So I started familiarizing myself with the whole sanction world a lot faster. And then through the process, you see actually specific businesses being added to the sanction list, and the impact is pretty swift.
Yeah.
Because the banks and all the data in banks is rather centralized these days. And so if somebody's added to the list, it's because a lot of research had already been done by the authorities in the background. So by the time the person is on the list or the company is on the list, so a lot of due diligence had already been done.
Well, this is the thing now. I've just set up a offshore account after years of being here. I've just had to do one. But to go through the KYC requirements of the bank, just as a little bloke sat in Dubai, it took months to set up. So the banks have to do their due diligence, prove their due diligence, and carry it out.
Well, yes, and that's so. And it's in the wake of that as well. And that, by the way, is also one of the reasons why we've had to become a lot more intimate with this subject, and it's because a lot of new people are moving into the UAE and they're wanting to set up bank accounts, but it's become a lot more difficult for them to do so because of all these KYCs.
Yeah.
And these and these new KYCs and new regulations are obviously in the wake of and the result of the sanctions that are being implemented and added on to almost every month by various sort of international authorities. So it's you kind of have this on both fronts. On the one hand, if you are just an ordinary person wanting to set up in the UAE or anywhere else, but we're talking about the UAE here today, it's a lot harder to open a bank account because the due diligence, the KYC process is a lot more strenuous. But on the other hand, also if you already have an active bank account, that's not necessarily a carte blanche for you to operate, because the minute you get added to the list, it's you feel the impacts of it very quickly.
How do you know if you're on? I mean, is the list published? Is it like the FBI top 10, or how do you find it?
Yes, so it's all public information, and
Right.
this is also how perhaps. As a U.S. person, let's say, or anybody who may be affected, you cannot play ignorance as an excuse, and including banks. So they cannot argue or claim, "Oh, we did not know," because this data is readily available.
That's not us.
Yeah.
Don't look.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's readily available. There's also loads of databases that contain or include this information on all types of sanctions lists, not just OFAC lists, but also other lists. And in fact, a lot of banks and financial authorities, and to an extent, even a lot of professional service providers, including law firms, especially of certain size, almost depending obviously on where they're operating and which regulations they're subject to, but they're also, many of them are actually required to conduct all sorts of KYCs and checks on their clients, and they have to have even these sort of markers and as part of have a membership to this different database information. So in the event one of their existing clients makes it to the new list, that they have these sort of red flags.
Right.
So it's a very complex area, and one that until recently was not of much sort of interest to me, and now just by virtue of kind of our client base, of where we sit, of the me being an American, and. We have become a lot more familiar with what it really means, and it's sort of it's extraterritorial effect.
Right.
Because it's quite extraordinary, because in no way, I'm a perfect example, but there's also a number of other clients or examples I can give you where, okay, here I'm an American citizen, okay, fine. So if somebody comes to me, if I have a client that is on the OFAC list, I cannot deal. So, and this is, by the way, these are the the kind of the general effects and consequences of somebody who is on the OFAC list. So not only can they not transact through the banks that deal with U.S. currency, which basically are 99.999% of the banks in the world. But also they cannot transact with any U.S. businesses or U.S. controlled businesses or U.S. persons, which means I am sitting here in the UAE, and if somebody came to me in the OFAC list and they said, I will pay you in cash, so there's no banking transfer that's involved, I still cannot work with them. I cannot represent them because I'm a U.S. person in this case. And so that's one example. Another example is that, and we've seen this here as well in the UAE, a number of certain companies UAE companies end up on the OFAC list, have nothing to do with the US. So they're not owned by US citizens. They're not a branch of a US entity. And they don't even deal with US I guess, direct interest, so they don't sell U.S. goods, but they make it on the list because of the good or service that they provide that the U.S. government, in this context, for example, believe are terrorist activities, for example, or threat to their security, or threat to whatever the U.S. considers to be their sort of values that they want to protect. So just by virtue of that, if they end up on the OFAC list, directly speaking, there is no consequence to them here because they're sitting in the UAE and they're not dealing with U.S. entities. But the ability to now transfer money or receive money for whatever it is, goods or services they're doing, is hugely curbed, and that means what business can you do if you cannot transact? And this, by the way, involves the company itself, not just its ability to receive money, right, and to sell goods or to sell services or to sell products and receive money, but also, for example, its employees, its license, and its just operations. And that's because if your bank as a company, because if your company blocked entity as a company, your bank account that belongs to you, the company, is now blocked, and therefore you're not able to access cash using that bank account or bank accounts that belong to that entity. So how do you pay employees? How do you pay for your trade license or your renewals or to your suppliers or to your customers?
Where are your lines of credit? But I can see that it's all kind of falling into place.
Yes,
now.
yes.
Yeah.
And so there have been a few entities in the UAE that have been added to the OFAC list, and because it's a U.S. regulations, a U.S. legislation. I've had a few people come my way because they look up U.S. lawyer and so they're interested in kind of learning. Okay, so what does that mean for our company and for us? I cannot deal with them because I am a U.S. person, and I therefore am blocked from dealing with. I'm prohibited from dealing with the blocked person.
Okay. Let me just butt in for a second. If you're prohibited from dealing with a blocked person, are you able in any way to deal with the person who's trying to become unblocked? And how do you once you're on the OFAC list, how do you get off the OFAC list?
Those are all great questions. And so one is... we've had a lot of these arguments, and I have to tell you again, I am not hiding. This is a fairly new area of law for me. So intuitively, as a lawyer, you always know you're all criminals. Everybody has a chance to hire a right to hire a lawyer, right? We always know that, even if you're as a bad person, a murderer, like everybody has a right to defense. That's one of the main principles of the U.S. Jurisprudence and Constitution. So you think, so as a lawyer, I have this sort of innate, like, well, okay, I understand this person is on a block as a blocked entity, as on the sanctions list, but I'm a lawyer, so obviously I can represent them in one thing or another, especially if it doesn't relate, for example, to what I think landed them on the OFAC list to begin with. Let's say it's a personal matter, right? It's a divorce or something like that, for example. Yes, or how does person's divorce or some sort of an inheritance matter potentially affect this kind of the accusations, allegations of their terrorist involvement, for example, right? I mean, because at the end of the day, that's sort of what these sanctions are for, is to curb global terrorism. So you think, so how does that? So I must be able to represent them, but in fact, lawyers are perhaps one of the main categories of service providers that are considered to be kind of what's called the conduit. To enabling various sort of suspect individuals and businesses to to basically conduct these activities, and it's because it's usually lawyers and law firms that create all these different offshores and the different trust accounts and the different offshore accounts and the restructuring and structuring. So lawyers have kind of developed a reputation actually being the enablers of a lot of these activities. And that's because through these kind of multifaceted and complex structuring, legal structuring, the ultimate beneficiaries are often unknown, and all sorts of activities are allowed to happen because because you cannot really link the ultimate decision maker, the ultimate beneficiary, with the sort of the final act or the final entity. So to my surprise, it wasn't. We were actually considered to be the perpetrators, and so they're therefore the first ones to be deemed as so prohibited from providing services to block persons. Okay. Now, there are, however, as you rightfully said, what if you're trying to get off the list because you consider, listen, this is unfair, because there are some people that end up on the list unfairly, or perhaps the sanctions are too broad. So there are, therefore, these what's called the licenses. You can apply, like there's a general license and there's a specific license that may allow someone to conduct business with you, to even if you're a blocked person, if you're on the OFAC list, if that service provider has either general license or specific license, they may be able to provide, even if they're a U.S. entity, they may be able to provide you with a service or deal with you. However, these are not so easy to obtain, and they're not what you may think, oh, as a lawyer, I've got this general license, so I can do it because I'm a lawyer. No, they're very specific. The sort of general license only apply to certain kind of activities, and they're very specific, and there'll be specific decree or specific regulation that will state, okay, this particular activity, for example, pharmaceutical good, right? The specific pharmaceutical good of that company basically can be dealt with, right? So that's called a sort of general exception. So it will be actually in the regulations themselves, in the sort of volume of regulations and the specific orders that will exempt a certain product, certain good from the overall sanctions by virtue of, for example, the kind of the non-threatening effect. So because you can imagine, let's say you have a lot of technology companies, right? So let's say 80% of the technology, what the technology company does is perfect legitimate business, but maybe 20% of some kind of parts that they supply, some sort of software they create, perhaps may be used or is used in some sort of terrorist or war-related activities, which may be on the sanction list. So you can see how part of that business could still be sectioned off for the purposes of these sanctions and licenses. So that's a general license. Specific license is something a lot more specific that you actually have to apply to the authorities, to the regulators, and say, I want to provide a sort of a specific service or this service to this individual. I'm asking for a specific license, and usually, and there's always both general and specific license that also actually have very, very, very strict monetary value. So another example of a general license for lawyers is that, for example, if you were on an OFAC list and you came to me and you said, listen, I was unfairly placed on the OFAC list, or I'm trying to clean up my act and not be associated with this list, or it's just the sanctions are too broad and they want at least to narrow the focus. So then I could represent you under the general license, but as long as it's specifically directed to your objective of trying to deal with the OFAC sanctions,
right?
Specifically, right? So that's me specifically trying to get Tim off the OFAC list, or me specifically working to limit the impact of the sanctions. So then I have this general license to help you, because then that goes back to the principle of like, if you still are you still deserve and you're entitled to a defense, so I can still represent you in connection with that, that very specific activity. But even then, interestingly enough, and this is quite interesting, quite clever if you ask me, my ability to represent you in this is very, very specifically limited to how much I can charge you. And there are very specific limitations, financial limitations, of how much I can charge you for that service. And that's interesting because, once again, it does not create the sort of incentive for me to just, because right now you've got your hands tied, right? So it creates an interesting incentive for me to just milk you for fees, because without me, you're really struggling.
Yeah.
So, but there isn't really much of a financial incentive for lawyers to represent. Financial incentive, right? I mean, there's
Sure.
obviously professional interest, and there's still, and there's the compensation is more or less supposed to, I guess, at the heart of it or the core of it is supposed to kind of be proportionate to the kind of the value that you're trying to create, but not extraordinarily high value. So it's quite interesting. So it's as a lawyer, if you are representing somebody under the sort of general license, you better be. But again, this is only an American lawyer or an American sort of citizen.
Yeah.
So if it's let's say you're a lawyer in France and you have nothing to do with the U.S. jurisdiction, then you don't have the same limitations. It's only me as a U.S. citizen, for example, or as a U.S. But also I think even as a U.S. qualified lawyer, even if you're not practicing in your own country, you still sort of are subject to these limitations. So really, it only just concerns U.S. people, persons.
Yeah.
But so there it is. So there. You could see when people are in need as a U.S. as a lawyer, people come to you like, well, I could, because it also is a very complex area of law, extremely complex, and it's so. Remember, as we mentioned earlier, by the time you make it on this list, I mean, a lot of due diligence had already been done.
Yeah.
And a lot of authorities had been involved.
My head's spinning, Ludmila, here, trying to keep up.
Trust me, it's still spinning for me, and I've been researching this and learning this for the last year.
Yeah.
So and because it's so complex, when somebody makes it to the list, chances are there's a lot of due diligence, a lot of intel that's already gone into the file that ultimately resulted and manifested itself on the actual list. So therefore, you try to kind of to challenge it or question it. You can see as a lawyer, it can be a lot of very lucrative work for you. And so the U.S. sanctions are drafted, or the regulations drafted in such a way that they do give the opportunity to the party that's on the list to have representation. They can also hire other lawyers, not U.S. lawyers, but if they want to have a U.S. lawyer, they still have representation, but there's no incentive to basically find the party to kind of abuse this, this situation. And therefore kind of contravene the idea of the sanctions themselves.
Okay. There's a lot to get your head around here. I mean, this is serious stuff. Let me ask you about cases that you've either been involved with, perhaps you have some knowledge of. Central Bank of the UAE, I know, cancelled the license of a Russian bank recently, MTS. And that bank had been placed on the OFAC list. Can you speak about that case? What do you know about that particular?
Yeah, I mean, this is all public news and public knowledge.
Yeah.
So there was a Russian bank that was recently set up in the UAE and had a license from the UAE Central Bank. And shortly after, and again, in the wake of these very complex, obviously, matter right now, and it was placed on the OFAC list very shortly after it was set up. And it was interesting because I, at a very intellectual level, a professional level, I was curious because this is a purely Russian bank and in the UAE. So, as and because it was a Russian bank in the UAE, it wasn't going to deal with the U.S. currency. So therefore, it would not be subject to those sanctions directly.
Mm-hmm.
Directly, that is, right? And yet it was placed on the OFAC list. And you think, okay, so what effect will it have ultimately? Not direct, because it's not really dealing with the U.S. currency. Therefore, no transactions can be blocked through the U.S. Central Bank because it's not passing to the U.S. Central Bank because it's
sure,
not
but the
dealing
UAE
with
currency is pegged to the US dollar, isn't it? So,
yes.
yeah.
So ultimately, shortly thereafter, obviously the UAE authorities themselves deemed that that kind of sort of bank to be to be perhaps unwanted. So they canceled their license. It was actually a pretty quick turnaround on all fronts, with regards to the bank being formed, with regards to it being placed on the OFAC list, and with regards to the license being canceled. Now, it's all public news. It's all in the media. It was an interesting, so to me, at a professional level, it was a very interesting development to have witnessed and watched and kind of realized the impact of these sanctions, and hence we're talking about this today, because it's less about the sort of this direct regulatory power where you are within the U.S. on the U.S. territory doing something. Therefore, obviously, you're directly subject to the U.S. regulators. Here, you're across the world, and you at many levels, you don't touch the U.S., for example.
The surprise is the scope of OFAC, isn't it? That's really the point here.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So that was one example, and it just shows you how, I guess, at least the UAE authorities deem it to be important enough to have to I guess collaborate with the U.S. At this level to where they deem these sanctions are serious enough, and therefore for this bank to exist undesirable for the UAE economy. So, so that's an interesting example there. Another example, we also had a client basically who reached out to the firm. They were looking for an American lawyer who knew something about OFAC, and in that case, so basically the company was not owned by Americans. It was actually owned, ironically enough, by Ukrainian. But they were dealing with again, this is all public news because I'm not disclosing anything here, but they're all on the list. You can go. In fact, you can do the search in OFAC by country. So, for example, you designate this, you select the sanctions, and then you select these entities that are UAE entities or Ukrainian entities or UK entities or Australian entities. So you can choose a specific country, and it will show you which entities based in a particular jurisdiction, for example, are on an OFAC list, or individuals. And interestingly enough, it even has individuals, for example, who their connection to the UAE is a property owned here. See, so
I see.
Yes. So the individual could be, for example, a Russian citizen or some other citizen, and if they're on the OFAC list, and they own a property here, so they will be shown as a UAE entity because they own a property here, for example. So not just a company, but a property. It's just some examples. Again, this is all public information. You could spend years going through these databases, and what we're talking about today is more specific in terms of OFAC related to the Russian war in Ukraine, but there are so many other lists, and as I said earlier, related to Iran and Yemen and Syria and Sudan and so on and so forth, and Iraq. So it's a very, very complex area of law and very sort of very voluminous database of information and names and companies, but now it's a lot more prominent here because of the Russian war, and so in this other case where the company was placed on the OFAC list because they supply drones. And the drones were basically ultimately, and again, this is in the list. These are specific lists where the drones were specifically implicated or have found to have been used by Russian military in Ukraine. And that's the company was sort of associated here. Or the company is based here. So therefore, that company ended up on the list, and they wanted to find out the repercussions, the implications, and again, my ability to counsel them as an American citizen is limited. Because, and I said, listen, if you want to be counsel advised regarding how to get off the list, I may be able to help you there and this general license. But in that particular case, you have to sort of understanding how the company operates in the line of business. I could not reasonably imagine a way by which you would get them off the list. so because there was no other business. You see, you can have a lot of businesses where only a portion of their businesses perhaps may be suspect or may be linked to a certain kind of undesirable activity. But in this particular case, there wasn't anything I could understand. I could not see how I could help. So some other lawyers could benefit, perhaps because they would not be restricted by the same restrictions I am, but I couldn't. There's also a number of other individuals that had come to us, who we've had dealings with in the past in one fashion or another. Who were later, also we found out later, were added to the OFAC list, and so that prevented our ability to operate or work with them, and provide services to them. So at least until they remain on the list. So it's a very, very all-encompassing development, and I'm just using us kind of as an example, because we're small, and this is just a kind of a drop in the ocean in terms of what's going on sort of around the world right now. But it's important, but because the UAE has made such tremendous efforts in the last several years of really of solidifying, of enhancing its legislative and legal framework by virtue of, for example, introducing the anti-money laundering regulations, the economic substance requirements, VAT, now the corporate tax, all sorts of the requirements of disclosure and confidentiality and exchange of information. There's been so many of these efforts, legislative efforts, where we as a law firm, we're subject to a whole new level of legislation just by virtue, for example, this anti-money laundering regulations. So it's interesting to see. So obviously for the UAE, this is also an important topic, and this is why we're talking about it today, because it's very easy if you're sitting here thinking, I'm so far away from all these countries that are doing all these sanctions, I'm completely protected, and I'm not. These topics are of no interest to me. But it's important to also be vigilant, and that's the point of this. It's important to be vigilant, and it's important to be plugged in and have access to these different databases of information, because it's very easy for you to fall on the wrong side of the law.
Well, you think you can run, but you certainly can't hide. It's the breadth of OFAC that's kind of dawning on me now. The scope of it, that kind of ever widening gyre. There's just no way of getting away from it.
It is kind of like a spider web, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, if you remember, like this Harry Potter movie. Remember when not a Harry Potter, Lord of the Ring. Right. When there's a big spider that's sort of kind of getting a little bit of web here and a little bit of web there. Before you know it, you're all kind of entangled in this, and that's sort of that's what we are seeing with regards to these sanctions. Interestingly enough, now I remember a few years ago, I also was approached by some other companies based here in the UAE who were worried because they were dealing with Iran, and they were worrying potentially that they were circumventing some of the Iranian sanctions, and they thought, well, we're not really sort of directly on the list, could we not do it? So this subject of sanctions comes up, especially here in this region, because we're so close physically and geographically to so many other countries. Yeah. So it comes up. It's an important subject to discuss, if for no other reason than just to raise awareness of the importance of being vigilant, of doing your customer due diligence, of doing your client due diligence, of all these KYCs. And we're all subject to it now as law firms, as accountants, auditors, real estate agents, banks, obviously financial service providers, corporate service providers. Everybody's subject to a more increased regulations. And so this is just kind of a reminder of all those that we can no longer just claim, I did not know, because information is out there. So it's important for all of us to just be vigilant, and for all the businesses here to continue to monitor, because it's the punishment, by the way, for evading sanctions is very, very draconian, and there's criminal sanctions and such. We didn't even talk about that, but that's so if you are trying to circumvent the sanctions, the punishments are pretty serious and severe, and so it's better to actually sort of know that you're blocked and pause until things kind of resolve themselves, than to try to circumvent them. Because if you circumvent them and you're discovered, it's not a good idea.
That was going to be my next question, but as soon as I hear a legal professional say draconian, I always think, okay, I ain't going there. That's Lawgical this time. The acronym OFAC, OFAC, the US Office of Foreign Asset Control. In simple parlance, that means sanctions. As ever, thank you for watching, listening, or both. And thanks to our legal expert, managing partner here at Yamalova and Plethka, Ludmila Yamalova. Thank you very much. I'm just coming back down to earth.
Thank you, Tim. It was surprisingly a lot more interesting and less boring than it could have been.
It's some story, it really is. You can find us at LY Law on social media, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok. You can find our podcast at lylawyers.com or on a podcast platform near you. If you'd like your legal question answered in an episode of Lawgical, or if you'd like to talk to a qualified UAE experienced legal professional, click contact at lylawyers.com.